Warm water slides over smooth white stone, and the air carries a faint mineral softness in the first light. The slope below you looks strangely divided between liquid and solid, as though snow had learned how to hold heat. Shallow basins gather the water in quiet steps, each rim overflowing into the next with almost no sound at all. From a distance, Pamukkale can seem frozen, bright as salt or ice, yet every pale ledge here is being made by movement. This whiteness is not a surface laid over the hill, but stones slowly left behind by spring water rising from deep underground. As the water reaches open air, something invisible begins to change, and the hillside records that change in thin new layers. Some pools are glassy blue, some are matte white, and some carry the faint cream or green trace of microbial films along their edges. The whole slope is connected, from the warm sources above to the lower shelves where overflow settles and hardens. And if you follow that gentle descent, pool by pool, the strange, quiet logic of this place begins to come into view. At first, it would be easy to mistake this for a finished surface, something settled long ago and left shining under the sky. But the water moving past your feet suggests something else, because every thin sheet crossing the stone is still carrying the material that built the ledges beneath it. That becomes the first clear shift in how you read the hillside. It is not a white hill with water on top. It is water becoming hill. The difference matters immediately, because once you notice it, each rim ahead begins to feel less like scenery and more like an edge in progress. A faint overflow slips over one lip, then spreads into the next basin below. And with that small movement, the entire slope starts to explain itself. What looks strange from a distance now starts to behave with a quiet order. Each shallow bowl receives warm mineral water, slows it, lets it cool, and passes part of it downward. Each step changes the water a little, and each change leaves behind a little more stone, so the decision becomes simple. Rather than stand still and admire the brightness from one place, you follow the flow. You choose to trace the water from the higher terraces toward the lower shelves, letting the descent of the slope become the line of the story. That choice alters everything you notice next. The upper basins no longer seem separate from the lower ones. They become the beginning of a sentence that continues across the whole hillside. A narrow channel curves through the white surface, no wider than a hand in some places, and the water in it holds a faint blue that deepens where the basin floor drops away. At the edge, the rim looks soft from a distance, almost like packed snow. Up close, it has a thin, chalky crust, delicate and fresh, with a texture closer to very fine porcelain than to rock weathered by wind. That fresh crust is the next clue. If it were ancient and inactive, it would feel more settled, more dulled by time. Instead, some edges look newly glazed. Some appear almost velvety with recent deposit. Some are still wet enough to shine, as though the white surface has only just been placed there. The cause of that brightness lies below the hill, out of sight. Long before this water ever reached the morning air, it moved underground through fractured rock, where heat and pressure shaped its chemistry in darkness. Pamukkale sits in southwestern Turkey, within a landscape where faults open pathways deep into the crust. Rain and groundwater sink into the earth, travel through limestone, warm at depth, and rise again carrying dissolved minerals. By the time that water reaches the surface, it has already had a long hidden history. It has moved through stone, taken something from it, and returned, changed. That invisible journey explains why the hillside can look so pale and yet remain warm to the touch. The whiteness is not snow. It is not salt blown in from some vanished sea. It is calcium carbonate, the same broad mineral family that makes limestone, chalk, and marble, now arriving in dissolved form inside spring water. And the moment that water emerges into open air, another change begins. Pressure drops, temperature shifts, some of the dissolved carbon dioxide starts to leave the water. Once that happens, the water can no longer hold the same amount of calcium in solution, so it releases it. Not all at once, not dramatically. just steadily, quietly along every lip and shallow floor where the water slows enough for stone to begin separating from flow. This is the second important reveal. The white terraces are not carved, they are precipitated. They are built grain by grain, film by film, from chemistry turning visible. You can see the evidence in the transitions between one pool and the next. In one basin, the water is clear and moving. In the next, a thin milky haze gathers near the edge. Below that, the overflow has already left a pale line where yesterday's path may have been slightly different from today's. The hillside keeps a record in these small boundaries, and once you begin looking for those records, the terraces stop seeming uniform. No two basins are exactly alike. One near the upper slope is smooth and almost perfectly reflective, holding the pale sky like polished glass. The one beneath it is shallower, its rim rougher, its surface broken by faint ripples where the incoming sheet of water spreads wider and thinner. Farther down, another basin has gone matte, nearly dry, its white floor scalloped and faintly brittle. That contrast raises the next question. If the whole slope belongs to one connected system, why do some pools gleam blue, while others look dormant, chalky, or empty? The answer begins with movement. Not all water arrives at every terrace with the same speed, volume, or temperature. A slight change in slope can redirect the flow. A thicker rim can hold water longer. A warmer stream can encourage more rapid mineral precipitation in one place, while a cooler, thinner sheet may leave less behind in another. Sunlight matters too. So does evaporation. So do the faint biological films that cling to the margins. What appears from afar as one white blanket is, on closer reading, a field of different conditions. Every basin is part of the same system, but every basin is having a slightly different day. That is why the hillside feels alive without ever moving quickly. The architecture is changing in slow, uneven increments. One ledge thickens, another dries. A channel narrows, then shifts to the side. A pale crust hardens where last season's overflow lingered. A lower shelf waits for more water, and while it waits, its brightness changes. Following the water downhill makes those differences easier to understand, because the process is repeated so many times that the logic becomes unmistakable. A rim forms because water hesitates there. Once the rim is a little higher, it holds the next shallow pool more effectively. That pool overflows at its lowest point. The overflow concentrates along a narrow path. As minerals continue to drop out of solution, the lip grows. Then the route of the spill becomes more defined. Then the basin behind it becomes more stable. The consequence is a staircase built by repetition, not by design, by persistence. You can almost feel the mechanism under each quiet overflow. A thin sheet spreads over a curved edge. Air meets warm water. Carbon dioxide escapes. Calcium carbonate settles. The rim thickens by an amount too small to watch directly. Yet over hours, days, seasons, and much longer spans, that nearly invisible deposit becomes a wall, a bowl, a shelf, a cascade of white steps down a mountain slope. That is what makes the place feel so unusual. It resembles frozen motion because it is motion slowed into form. And the closer you stay to one thread of water, the more convincing that becomes. A trickle emerging near the upper source passes over a creamy lip no taller than your ankle. It enters a basin where the floor has a faint blue cast, not because the water is deep, but because the white mineral beneath it reflects the light in a softer way. The basin fills to the edge, then releases part of itself over one side. That release is so quiet it is almost hidden. No dramatic splash, no foaming torrent, just a continuous soft spill, more like silk being drawn over a smooth surface than water falling over rock. Because the sound is so restrained, the visual change carries more weight. You begin to notice how every overflow line marks a threshold. Above the line, water is still carrying dissolved minerals. At the line, chemistry shifts enough for those minerals to settle. Below the line, a new surface slowly begins. This repeated boundary is one of the strangest things about Pamukkale. The hillside is filled with edges where liquid becomes stone, and it does so gently that the transformation feels almost secretive. If you are passing quickly, you might only remember the brightness, but moving slowly forces a deeper reading. You see that some rims are rounded and thick, built over long periods of reliable flow. Others are thin and fragile, perhaps newer, perhaps less frequently fed. Some lower shelves show hairline cracking where dry periods have interrupted the smooth skin of wet deposit. That introduces the first quiet stake in the landscape. Pamukkale is delicate because it is unfinished. A carved cliff can endure by remaining what it already is. These terraces depend on continued water movement. If the warm flow changes course, slows too much, or stops reaching a certain shelf, the white surface there can lose its sheen. Without fresh mineral water, active growth pauses. Moisture leaves. The surface dulls. In places, it can become brittle or gather dust or weather into a less luminous texture. So the beauty here is tied to continuity. The same process that made the terraces must keep touching them. That does not make the place feel fragile in a dramatic sense. It makes it feel ongoing, like a sentence that has to keep being spoken. As the sun rises higher, details sharpen along the upper channels. The spring water itself remains warm, warmer than the morning air, and that warmth gives the slope its subtle contradiction. Everything looks cool and white. Everything suggests snowfields, salt pans, or ice cascades. Yet the water running over the stone carries heat from below ground. That contradiction is part of the spell. Your eyes say winter, your skin says spring. And between those two impressions, the geology becomes easier to remember. This is not a mountain surface dressed in white by weather alone. It is a thermal landscape. The source is hidden, but its signature is everywhere. To understand the hill fully, you have to imagine the unseen path backward. Rain falls somewhere beyond view. Water sinks through cracks in rock. It descends through a fractured region shaped by tectonic stretching in the Buke Menderes Graben, where the crust has been pulled and opened over long spans of time. That stretching matters because it creates the faults and fractures that allow deep circulation. Without those pathways, the groundwater would not move the same way. Without that movement, it would not warm, dissolve minerals, and rise in concentrated spring flows. So even here, on this quiet white slope, the broad architecture of the earth is present, not as violence, as permeability, as a long arrangement of openings through which heat and water can meet. The spring water rises through limestone-rich rocks. As it travels, it dissolves calcium and carries dissolved carbon dioxide. At depth, under pressure, that combination remains stable enough to stay invisible. Then the water reaches daylight. Contact with open air changes the balance. The carbon dioxide begins to escape. The water loses some of its capacity to hold the dissolved calcium, and the excess becomes stone. That sentence can sound technical until you watch it expressed across the slope. Then it feels very plain. Warm water comes up clear, warm water meets air, white stone remains behind. The explanation is gentle enough to match the landscape. No single moment announces itself. No visible switch is thrown. But the evidence keeps accumulating underfoot and downhill, and because it accumulates in linked basins, the hillside becomes a map of process rather than a static object. That is why following one path of water downward was the right decision. If you had stayed above, the terraces might still look decorative. If you had only seen them from below, they might seem like a bright shell spread over the hillside. Walking with the flow reveals sequence. Source leads to channel. Channel leads to basin. Basin leads to overflow. Overflow builds rim. Rim redirects water. Redirected water creates the next basin. Cause and effect repeat until the whole slope reads like a chain of patient consequences. Now, as the eye moves laterally across the terrace field, more differences come forward. Some pools are edged with a pale cream tint. Some carry a whisper of green. Those colors are subtle, almost easy to miss against the dominant white, but they matter. They suggest that chemistry is not acting alone. Thin microbial films can settle where temperature and flow allow them to persist. Algae and bacteria at the margins can influence how particles are trapped, how surfaces feel, and where certain textures take hold. The whiteness remains the main impression, yet life is already present as a fine layer within the mineral story. That realization adds another note of strangeness. A place that first appeared almost sterile, too white to hold anything living, begins to show faint evidence of small communities woven into the wet edges. Still, the geological process remains in command of the overall shape. The basin walls are mineral architecture first. Life occupies the margins, and those margins are precise. In the warmest flows, some organisms have less room to persist. Where water cools slightly or lingers in a thinner sheet, soft films may appear. Where a channel dries, that tint can fade, so color itself becomes evidence of local conditions. A cream edge may suggest one balance of warmth, flow, and mineral load. A greener seam may indicate another. The terraces are not only building stone, they are sorting microhabitats in thin ribbons. By late morning, the repeated forms begin to feel less repetitive and more conversational. Each basin answers the one above it. Here is a thicker rim because more water passed this way for longer. Here is a basin gone quiet because the roots shifted. Here is a fresh glaze because active deposition continues along this edge. Here is a roughened patch because evaporation outpaced replenishment for a while. The hillside keeps explaining itself if you remain patient enough to let one clue lead to the next. And patience is the right scale for a place like this. Travertine does not ask to be understood quickly. It forms through accumulation. So understanding it also arrives through accumulation. A bright ledge, a warm channel, a chalky crust, a blue basin, a dry shelf, a cream film along the edge, a soft overflow, then another, then another. Soon the slope no longer looks like a collection of pretty pools. It feels like an exposed mechanism, a visible interface between deep groundwater, surface air, gravity, sunlight, heat, and time. That is the deeper meaning of its strange beauty. Pamukkale does not merely display a rare surface. It shows hidden geology in the act of becoming visible. And because the process is still underway, the place carries a subtle tension. Not tension in the sense of danger, tension in the sense of incompletion. What you are seeing is present tense. This terrace is still being coated. That rim is still thickening. This channel may still shift. That lower basin may brighten again if more water returns. Every active pool holds the possibility of further shape. The hillside has not finished deciding what it will look like. That unfinished quality changes how the eye rests on even the smallest ledge. A fragile white lip, no thicker than a folded blanket of mineral crust, suddenly carries centuries of implication. If overflow remains steady, it may become a stronger wall. If flow thins, it may remain delicate. If the route changes, another lip somewhere nearby may begin to take over the work. So the terraces are not monuments to a single past event. They are the current surface of an ongoing exchange. And as that becomes clearer, it makes sense to keep moving closer to the springs themselves, where the invisible part of the story comes nearest to the surface, and where the warm water first arrives carrying the chemistry that writes this white slope, line by line. Near the upper part of the slope, the water gathers in places that seem almost too calm to explain the wide white field below. From a distance, a spring can look modest, just a warm emergence from pale stone, a clear beginning without much drama. Up close, it becomes easier to understand how a landscape can be built by something so quiet. The water arrives already carrying a hidden load, not sand, not silt, not visible grains of white rock. It carries dissolved calcium and dissolved CO2, taken into solution during a long underground passage through limestone and along deep fractures. That is the important part to hold on to now. The spring is not making stone from nothing. It is delivering material that has been gathered elsewhere, under pressure, in darkness, over time. When that water is still below ground, The conditions are different enough for the minerals to remain dissolved. Pressure is higher. The chemical balance is steadier. The water can hold more than it will be able to hold once it reaches the open hillside. Then it rises. It meets daylight. It cools a little. It loses pressure. And, very gently, it starts to release what it has been carrying. This is why the chemistry of Pamukkale feels so strange when you first understand it. The landscape is made from an unloading. Water comes up full, air changes it. Stone is left behind. If you stay with a single thread of flow, that sequence becomes visible in stages. At the spring mouth, the water can appear almost completely clear. A few steps lower, where it has spread into a thin sheet, there may be the faintest clouding near the edges. Below that, the clouding has turned into a powdery film on the basin floor. Farther down, that film has become a crust, then a rim, then a little wall, then another basin waiting beneath it. Nothing in that chain is abrupt. That softness is part of what makes the place memorable. Pamukkale does not hide its process behind violence or speed. It lets the whole hillside act as a slow demonstration. You can picture the dissolved carbon dioxide leaving the water without ever seeing bubbles in the dramatic way you might expect. The gas simply begins to escape because the conditions have changed. The water is no longer where it was. Its balance has shifted, and when that balance shifts, calcium carbonate can precipitate out. That word, precipitate, can sound technical. Here it feels almost domestic. A substance settles out. A surface forms. A line whitens. A wet edge hardens. The hill is written one thin deposit at a time. The warmth of the spring matters as much as the chemistry. This is a geothermal system, which means the water has been heated during its circulation underground. Not boiling, not rushing in clouds of steam across the whole slope. Just warm enough to feel distinctly unlike ordinary runoff. That warmth changes how the place is perceived. Your eyes still meet a whiteness that suggests cold, but the spring water tells a different story. It has come from depth, not from snowmelt. Its source is thermal, not seasonal in the simple sense, and because the water has traveled through rock, its temperature and chemistry are linked. The journey through the subsurface is not only a path, it is a preparation. As groundwater moves down through fractures and permeable layers, it encounters carbonate rocks that can dissolve under the right conditions. Carbon dioxide, carried in groundwater and produced through natural processes underground, helps the water become slightly acidic. That mild acidity allows it to dissolve calcium carbonate from limestone. So the water that rises here has done chemical work on the way. It has moved through the bedrock not as a passive passenger, but as a quiet solvent. Then, once it reaches the surface, the process begins to reverse. That reversal is one of the clearest ways to understand the entire slope. Below ground, rock dissolves into water. Above ground, water releases rock. Below, stone becomes invisible. Above, the invisible becomes white. If you look at the upper channels with that in mind, each one starts to read almost like a sentence translated from underground conditions into surface form. A narrow groove with an actively whitening edge suggests steady flow. A smoother basin with very little rim growth may suggest a different rate of movement or a different recent history of water coverage. A dry branch, pale but no longer glossy, suggests a path that carried more water before. The chemistry is not acting in isolation from shape. The chemistry creates shape, and then shape alters the chemistry by changing how the water moves. That feedback is where the hillside becomes more than a set of pools. Once a small lip begins to form, it slows water slightly behind it. That pooled water may cool a little more, spread differently, and overflow in a narrower place. The overflow then concentrates deposition along that low point. As the rim thickens, it holds the basin more effectively. The basin becomes more distinct. The next overflow becomes more focused. A tiny beginning becomes architecture. This kind of self-reinforcing growth is common in mineral landscapes, but here it is unusually legible. Pamukkale gives the process room to be seen. The white color helps, the open slope helps, The repeated basins help. You do not need to imagine the hidden mechanism from a few clues. You can watch its consequences stepping downward again and again. That is why the springs above matter so much. They are not merely sources in the ordinary sense. They are the point where the hidden and visible parts of the system overlap most closely. At the spring, you are as near as you can get to the underground history without leaving the surface. You are watching deep circulation arrive in a form the eye can follow. The water emerging here may have spent a very long time in the subsurface. Not every droplet follows the same path or remains underground for the same duration. Some waters move along more direct fractures, some circulate through broader zones of porous rock, some mix with other waters before emerging, but the general story remains steady. Groundwater descends. Heat and rock chemistry alter it. Faults and fractures guide it back upward. The result appears here as thermal spring discharge. That wider geological setting matters because Pamukkale is not an accidental whiteness placed on an otherwise unrelated slope. It belongs to a tectonically active region, where crustal extension has helped create the openings through which geothermal water can circulate. The Buke Menderes Graben, a broad extensional structure in western Turkey, is part of that background. A graben is an area where blocks of the crust have moved downward between faults as the land is stretched. That stretching does not only shape the valley, it also shapes the plumbing. Fractures created or reactivated by extension give groundwater routes to travel deep and return warm. So the white terraces are connected in a very quiet way to the slow architecture of the crust itself. That can seem surprising at first. The surface looks soft, rounded, delicate, almost cloud-like in places. Yet beneath it lies a story of tectonic openness, geothermal circulation, and chemical exchange across long spans of time. The softness above is possible because the earth below is fractured enough to let water move. That is one of the gentlest ironies of the place. A landscape that looks like fabric depends on broken rock. If the spring flow were constant in every detail, year after year, the terrace field might seem easier to predict. But natural systems are not that uniform. Flow rates vary. Some channels carry more water in one period than another. Temperature can shift slightly. Evaporation changes with season, sunlight and wind. Different outlets may become more or less active. These changes do not erase the overall pattern. They create the fine variations that make each part of the slope distinct. Near one spring vent, the water may spread in a broad reflective sheet. Near another, it may stay confined to a narrower runnel, tracing a bright path before spilling into a bowl below. Where flow remains strong and regular, fresh deposition can keep surfaces smooth and lustrous. Where it weakens, the surface may lose that living glaze and look chalkier. So the chemistry explains the white stone, but hydrology explains much of the patterning. How much water arrives, how long it lingers, where it spills, where it thins. Those simple differences decide where the hillside appears actively alive and where it seems to be resting. The spring mouths themselves can also be read in this way. Some emerge in clearly defined channels. Others seem to seep more diffusely through wet white ground, the water collecting before it chooses a direction. That choice is shaped by slight topography built by previous deposition. In other words, the spring water is moving across a surface that earlier spring water already made. The landscape is both cause and consequence. Older travertine guides new flow. New flow creates newer travertine. That looping relationship gives Pamukkale its sense of self-continuity. The place is not just accumulating material, it is teaching the water where to go next. And yet, it never teaches it perfectly. A basin can overflow on one side until the rim there thickens enough that another lower point becomes more favorable. A narrow channel can slowly clog with mineral deposit and nudge water toward an adjacent route. A shallow shelf can brighten with new mineral coating after a period of relative dryness, if a small upstream shift sends fresh water back across it. Because of that, the terraces should be imagined less as fixed structures and more as temporary answers to the current pattern of flow. Some answers last a long time, some do not. All remain contingent on the next movements of warm water. If you pause by one upper pool long enough, you begin to notice tiny evidence of this ongoing decision making. The inflow enters at one edge, carrying warmth and a subtle clarity. Across the basin, the water slows until the surface becomes almost still. At the far lip, it gathers in a slightly deeper line before slipping over. That slightly deeper line is important. It is where movement focuses. It is where the mineral edge can be reinforced. It is where future shape is most likely to emerge. The basin is not simply holding water. It is selecting where the next stone will gather fastest. That selection happens everywhere on the slope. Each pool is a small sorting device. It sorts motion, it sorts depth, it sorts the time water spends touching air. It sorts where dissolved minerals remain in solution and where they become visible deposit. Seen this way, the terrace field is a giant cascade of chemical decisions, each one subtle, each one shaping the next. This also explains why the surface is so responsive to interruption. If one part of the route receives less water than before, the conditions there change almost immediately at a small scale. The glossy film may dry, evaporation may leave a rougher texture, dust can settle more easily on a surface no longer rinsed by constant flow. Microbial films may shift with the altered moisture and temperature. The white remains, but the quality of the white changes. It can move from luminous and wet to powdery and still. The difference is not cosmetic alone. It tells you whether the surface is still actively participating in the main process. An active terrace is not just present, it is being maintained. It is being renewed by every passing sheet of mineral water. This is why protection and careful water management matter so much in a place like this, even though the process itself is natural. A living travertine system depends on circulation. Change the routing too much, and some terraces stop receiving what they need. Leave a basin dry for too long, and it may no longer look like a freshly forming mineral surface. Pamukkale teaches a broad lesson through a very local one. Some landscapes remain beautiful because they are stable, others remain beautiful because they are continuously fed. This one belongs to the second kind. And the feeding happens from below. That hidden supply is what gives the springs their calm authority. They are modest in appearance, but everything on the slope depends on them. Without the warm mineral source, the white basins would become only a memory of earlier flow. With it, they remain part of an active exchange between deep geology and open air. As the eye lingers at the sources, another detail begins to matter. The spring water is clear enough that the deposited stone can seem to appear almost after the water is passed, as if the hillside is whitening in the wake of transparency. That visual contradiction adds to the place's strange character. In muddy rivers or sediment-heavy streams, you can see the load immediately. Here, the load is dissolved. The water looks light. Its work looks delayed. Only by watching where it slows, spreads, and cools do you understand that clarity is not emptiness. The water may look simple, but it is chemically crowded. That is one reason the place can feel slightly unreal at first encounter. The eye has learned to associate white buildup with visible residue, crust, or evaporation from obviously concentrated liquid. Pamukkale offers something gentler, clear, warm water gliding over white stone that it is, at the same time, helping to create. It is an almost invisible transfer until the terrace itself reveals what has happened. This is also where time becomes harder to judge. Some changes are too slow to notice directly. No rim grows visibly while you stand there. No basin deepens before your eyes. And yet every active edge is in motion at the microscopic scale. Molecules are leaving solution. Crystals are forming. Thin films are settling and hardening. The landscape is changing without performance. That can make the place feel ancient in a special way. Not old because it is inactive, old because it operates at a speed wider than ordinary attention. If you imagine a single day, the terrace looks still. If you imagine seasons, years, and centuries, it becomes fluid again. A rim 1 finger thick may represent countless overflows. A broad shelf may record many changes in routing and deposition. An inactive pale patch may be the remnant of an earlier active channel, so the springs are never just present-day features. They are the immediate source of the present surface, but they also continue a story that has been rewritten many times. Travertine can build, break, dry, regrow, and redirect. What you see now is the latest arrangement in a long family of arrangements. That is another reason Pamukkale does not feel like carved sculpture. Sculpture suggests a fixed intention, completed at some point. This hillside feels more like weather, with memory. The upper water arrives, responds to the shape before it, changes that shape slightly, then leaves a new surface for tomorrow's flow to interpret. The slope remembers by remaining alterable. As morning moves toward late morning, the light helps separate active areas from resting ones. The active surfaces often reflect the sky more clearly. They carry a blue cast or a faint silvery sheen because a thin layer of water is present. The less active ones look drier, softer, more powder white. That difference is useful. It lets you read the chemistry through the optics. Where water still runs, the terrace remains connected to the spring system in the present tense. Where it does not, the whiteness becomes more archival, still part of the same history, but not being written at the same speed. And even in active areas, the writing is uneven. One edge receives a constant film. A neighboring shelf catches only intermittent overflow. A small notch in a rim sends a focused thread down one side, while another side stays nearly dry. These asymmetries matter because they are how large forms begin. A slight preference in flow becomes a stable spillway. A stable spillway becomes a deeper channel. A deeper channel delivers more consistent water to one lower basin than to another. The favored route grows clearer. The unfavored route grows quieter. The terrace field is full of these soft selections. Nothing is forced, nothing is symmetrical for long. Yet the outcome is organized. That balance between order and irregularity is one of the reasons the hillside feels natural in such a satisfying way. It is not chaotic. It is not rigid. It is patterned because physical laws are consistent, but it is varied because the conditions are never perfectly uniform. Water, gravity, gas exchange, temperature, evaporation, and microtopography all collaborate. No single factor tells the whole story. The springs begin it, but the slope elaborates, and the elaboration continues downward in increasingly visible architecture. A small crest becomes a basin rim. A basin rim becomes a miniature dam. A miniature dam creates a new pool. A new pool establishes a new overflow line. That overflow line, if fed long enough, can create another convex lip below, so the entire white cascade can be understood as nested scales of the same process. At the smallest scale, minerals precipitate from solution. At the next scale, films become crusts. At the next, crusts become rims. At the next, rims become terraces. At the broadest scale, an entire mountainside begins to resemble frozen water, while actually being built by warm water in motion. This nested repetition is why the place can hold your attention for so long without changing its basic idea. The same principle keeps appearing, but never in exactly the same form. One spring outlet shows it in a thin, translucent edge, another in a thick, chalky wall, another in a shallow, glowing basin, another in a dry fossil trace of former flow. Everywhere the chemistry is the same in essence. Everywhere the local expression differs. And beneath that local expression lies the same hidden underground partnership of rock, heat, and circulation. It helps, here, to picture the water before it arrives. Not as a single underground river, because the subsurface is often more complicated than that. Instead, imagine a broad system of fractures, porous zones, and carbonate rocks through which groundwater moves over long periods. Some of that water descends far enough to warm. Some dissolves significant amounts of calcium carbonate because of the conditions it encounters. Some mixes along the way. Then, because faults and fractures offer return paths, portions of that groundwater emerge as thermal springs. What arrives at the surface is the visible output of a much larger hidden circulation cell. The terrace field is therefore not just a surface deposit, It is the skin of a hydrogeological system. That phrase may sound clinical, but the place itself makes it easy to feel. Everything on the slope depends on an exchange between below and above. The underground sets the chemistry. The atmosphere finishes the reaction, gravity arranges the result. That three-part relationship is the core of Pamukkale's strangeness. If any one part were missing, the famous white terraces would not exist in this form. Without carbonate-rich rock, there would be less calcium to transport. Without geothermal circulation and tectonic pathways, the water would not rise warm and mineral-laden in the same way. Without exposure to open air and downhill flow, the dissolved load would not precipitate into step-like Travertine architecture. The place is therefore not a single phenomenon, it is a meeting point. That is why it seems to hover between categories. It looks frozen, but it is warm. It looks sculpted, but it is growing. It looks barren from afar, but it carries fine life along the margins. It looks ancient, yet it is still under construction. The closer you stay to the spring-fed upper basins, the clearer those contradictions become. Even the smallest overflow can teach the whole system. A transparent sheet slips over a white lip. The lip is there because earlier water left mineral deposit behind. This new sheet now touches air, cools slightly, and releases a bit more of its dissolved burden. A film gathers where the flow thins. The lip gains another almost immeasurable layer. The process repeats. That is all. And because that is all, repeated enough, an entire luminous hillside can exist. There is comfort in how uncomplicated the mechanism becomes once you stop expecting spectacle. The springs are not mysterious because they are unknowable. They are mysterious because so much visible beauty comes from such patient chemistry. That patience extends beyond the mineral side of the story. The water's movement itself has a kind of discipline. It does not rush to the bottom in a single torrent. It pauses constantly, it gathers, it waits in shallow bowls, it spills only after enough has collected. That repeated pause is what gives the terraces their step-like appearance, and it also gives the landscape its quiet mood. That quiet is not empty. It comes from the way the hillside slows everything that touches it. Flow slows, sound slows. Even your sense of time seems to spread out, the way water spreads thin over a pale rim. And once the pace of the place settles into you, another layer of the strangeness becomes easier to see. Pamukkale is not only white because minerals are leaving the water, it is white in different ways depending on how that water has behaved. A newly active edge can look almost glazed, its surface smooth enough to reflect light in a soft, uninterrupted sheet. A nearby shelf, only a few steps away, may look duller, almost powdery, because the film of water there has thinned or disappeared. Another basin may hold a deeper blue, simply because its floor drops a little more and the water remains pooled long enough to become mirror-like. So the terrace field is really a collection of related surfaces, each one recording a slightly different balance of flow, cooling, evaporation, and deposit. This is where the hillside becomes less like a single object and more like an archive. Not an archive of dramatic events, an archive of minor differences. A little more overflow here, a little less there, a small shift in channel direction, a dry period long enough to roughen a shelf, a return of water that restores gloss to one basin and leaves another untouched. When you move across the slope with those differences in mind, the eye starts to read the terrain almost the way it would read handwriting. Some lines are fresh and bright, some are faded, some overlap older marks, some stop suddenly where the sentence of water changed direction. And because these marks are made by mineral-rich spring flow, they are records of both movement and chemistry at once. A thicker rim usually means repeated overflow over time. A smoother basin floor suggests continued wetness and fresh deposition. A broken or cracked edge may indicate drying, interruption, or a period when active growth paused. The forms are beautiful, but they are also evidence. This is important because beauty alone can make Pamukkale feel almost too unreal, too decorative. The white terraces have such a softened brightness that they can seem separate from ordinary geology. But the closer you look, the more factual they become. A basin is not merely elegant, it is a response to slope and flow. A rim is not merely graceful, it is the accumulated result of dissolved calcium carbonate leaving water again and again at a favored edge. Even the delicate scalloped shapes along some pool margins have causes that can be named: water speed, microtopography, the thickness of previous deposit, tiny interruptions that slightly redirect a thin sheet of flow. This is where late morning light becomes useful. As the sun rises higher, it does not erase the hillside's softness, but it sharpens the distinctions between wet and dry ground. The active channels shine. The resting ones turn more matte. The freshest mineral skin can appear faintly creamy before it hardens into a brighter white. Where the water lies deeper, blue tones intensify. Where only a thin, wet glaze remains, the white beneath seems almost luminous. That range of appearances is one reason visitors sometimes describe Pamukkale in conflicting ways. One person sees snow, another sees cloud, another sees salt, another sees frozen waterfalls. All of those comparisons are understandable because the surface borrows visual qualities from each of them, yet none is quite right. Snow melts into water. Here, water turns into stone. Salt flats are often born of evaporation from more obviously concentrated water. Here, much of the key change begins when dissolved gas escapes and the water can no longer carry so much calcium. Frozen waterfalls suggest sudden stoppage. Pamukkale is the opposite. It is built by continuation. Its shapes come from repeated flow, not from arrested collapse. That mismatch between appearance and process is part of why the place stays in the mind. It asks your eyes to revise themselves, and once they do, each terrace seems more interesting than before. A broad upper pool with still water can be understood as a temporary holding space where the water's journey slows enough for its chemistry to keep changing. A narrow outlet from that pool can be read as a place of concentration, where flow becomes focused and where a lip may thicken fastest. Below that, a fan of water spreading over a shallow shelf may produce only a very thin deposit over a wider area. Below again, another rim catches part of that spread and restarts the process in a more contained form. The pattern is recursive. The same basic events happen again and again, but scale and position alter the result. That is why no two sections of the slope look entirely alike. One part resembles stacked bowls, another resembles draped cloth, another feels almost architectural, like miniature terraces built by some patient hand. Another returns to near-flat shelves, where water only hints at a basin before moving on. Each shape is a local solution to the same larger condition. Warm mineral water must descend. As it descends, it changes. As it changes, it leaves matter behind. The slope receives those changes and organizes them into form. Some of the most revealing places are not the largest pools, but the minor edges between them. A lip only a few centimeters high can tell the same story as a much larger wall. If it is wet and bright, it is active. If a fine line of fresh deposit clings to its crest, mineral precipitation is still reinforcing it. If the basin behind it remains full enough to spill steadily, then the lip is not only a remnant of former flow, it is a current boundary still doing work. That distinction between remnant and active edge matters all across Pamukkale. The white hillside includes both living surfaces and older traces. Some terraces are fully part of the present hydrological pattern. Others are older expressions of routes the water once preferred more strongly. The difference may be subtle from a distance, but up close it becomes legible. Active surfaces shine and renew themselves. Inactive ones still preserve shape, but their texture grows drier, rougher, or more weathered. This gives the landscape an unusual relationship with time. Multiple timescales are present in the same view. The water moving now belongs to the present minute. The glossy film on an active shelf belongs to today's flow. The rim beneath it may record years or centuries of similar overflow. A dry basin nearby may preserve an older arrangement no longer fed in the same way. So you are never looking at one moment alone, you are looking at current water crossing older decisions made by previous water. That layered timing is why the hillside can feel both immediate and ancient without contradiction. Its present is always resting on visible memory. The more carefully you compare the basins, the more sensitive the differences become. Some rims are thick and rounded, suggesting long periods of stable overflow in one place. Some are wafer thin, almost too delicate to trust, as though a small redirection of flow could abandon them. Some floors remain smooth because water keeps rinsing and coating them. Others gather tiny irregularities because they spend more time drying, warming in sunlight, and receiving less continuous mineral renewal. Even the edges of shadow and light matter. A terrace exposed longer to sun may experience more evaporation. Evaporation can concentrate minerals further and alter how quickly thin films dry and harden. In another basin, a slightly deeper pool may protect the floor from drying and keep the surface optically darker, more reflective, more blue. Nothing here depends on one factor alone. Every visible difference tends to come from several causes overlapping. Flow rate matters, temperature matters, basin depth matters, sunlight matters, the precise route of entry matters, a small notch in a rim matters. That complexity never becomes chaotic because all of it is filtered through a simple physical rule. Water must move downhill. That shared direction keeps the landscape understandable. No matter how varied the details become, the logic remains legible. Everything above influences everything below. A shift near the upper slope can change which lower shelves receive steady overflow. A rim that thickens enough to redirect spill can starve one basin and revive another. A channel that narrows with new deposit can become more efficient, delivering a more focused stream farther down. This is why tracing the terraces downward is more illuminating than merely looking across them. The slope is not arranged as independent pools set beside one another. It is a connected sequence. Its architecture is hydrological first, scenic second. That understanding also introduces a quiet kind of stake. If the route of water changes too much, the visible character of the slope changes with it. The terraces are not just there to be admired. They depend on the continuation of specific relationships between source, flow, and overflow. A lower basin that gleams now does so because countless small upstream conditions still favor its filling. Interrupt those conditions, and the basin can begin to rest, not disappear immediately, not collapse, just stop being renewed. Its blue fades. Its gloss softens. Its surface begins to belong more to memory than to process. That is a subtle but important difference. Pamukkale is often photographed as if the terraces were permanent in every visible detail. In reality, permanence here exists at the level of system, not at the level of each exact shape. Thermal water will continue to rise so long as the larger geological conditions allow it. Travertine will continue to form where chemistry and flow still make that possible, but which basin is brightest, which rim is thickening fastest, and which channel is becoming quieter, those can change. So the hillside is stable in one sense and provisional in another. Its identity persists, its details drift. That combination makes it feel more like a living landscape than a static monument. And by now, as the late morning develops, it becomes natural to widen your attention just slightly. The terraces are not only mineral forms, they are also surfaces touched by thin life. At first, that life seemed incidental, almost too faint to mention. Against all this whiteness, now it becomes impossible to ignore. Along some wetter margins, a pale cream cast appears where pure white gives way to a softer tone. In a few channels, especially where water moves in a shallower, more stable thread, there may be a whisper of green. Elsewhere, a faint gold tint catches in the light, barely present, but enough to disturb the idea that this place is made of stone alone. These are the delicate signatures of microbial communities and algae living where conditions allow. They do not dominate the landscape. They do not cover the terraces in thick, obvious growth. They remain thin, selective, and often nearly invisible until the eye learns to look for them. But once you see them, Pamukkale gains another layer of meaning. The same warm water that carries dissolved minerals also creates narrow habitats, temperature sorts where different organisms can persist. So does water speed. So does the thickness of the flowing film. So does exposure to sunlight. Some sections are simply too warm, too mineral heavy, or too unstable for much visible growth. Other sections, especially transitional zones where water cools slightly or spreads more gently, allow biofilms to take hold. These films may trap tiny particles. They may alter the texture of the surface beneath. They may influence where minerals accumulate more readily. In some cases, they can help produce textures that later harden into part of the travertine itself. That means the border between geology and life is not cleanly drawn here. The main architecture is still mineral. The terraces are still primarily a product of thermal water chemistry and deposition, but life participates at the margins, softening the idea that this is a purely inorganic sculpture. A thin microbial layer can create a slightly different surface roughness. That roughness can affect how water spreads. A subtly altered flow pattern can influence where precipitation is favored. And once deposit begins to gather over or around those biological textures, the shape remains, even if the living film later changes or disappears. This is one of the quiet revelations of the hillside. Some forms that seem purely mineral may have been gently assisted by life, not built by life alone, not explained by biology alone, but nudged, textured, given a little help at the moment when a thin film becomes a more durable skin of stone. The warmer margins tell part of this story. In the hottest emerging waters, biological growth can be limited. The chemistry is active, the temperature high, and the setting can remain too unstable for many visible communities to establish themselves strongly. A little farther along, where the water has cooled by only a small amount and spread into shallower films, the possibility widens. There, faint color may appear, a touch of cream on the edge, a soft green seam in a narrow runnel, a gold-brown dusting where light, warmth, and moisture remain balanced for long enough. That distribution is not random decoration. It is ecological pattern. Each tint marks a microhabitat. And because these microhabitats depend on the same flow network that builds the terraces, they are as sensitive to change as the mineral surfaces themselves. If a channel dries, the biology along it changes. If water is rerouted, another strip of the hillside may suddenly become suitable for a different film or community. If a basin remains wetter for longer, microbial persistence may increase there. If the mineral load changes, or the temperature shifts, the biological edge shifts too. So the life here is never separate from the geology. It lives within the conditions the geothermal system creates. That fact deepens the meaning of every subtle color variation. A terrace is not just active or inactive. It may also be more or less hospitable, and hospitality here is measured in fractions. A little more cooling, a little less speed, a little more sunlight, a little less mineral stress. This gentle ecological sorting makes the slope feel less barren than it first appeared. There is life here, but it is life that has learned to remain thin, patient, and precise. Nothing loud, nothing abundant in the ordinary lush sense. No broad meadow of vegetation. No obvious foresting of the basins. Instead, thin films and microscopic communities inhabit the places where warm stone and moving water make just enough room. That restraint suits the landscape. Pamukkale does not become richer by becoming busier, it becomes richer by revealing that even its simplest surfaces are not simple at all. Take one narrow channel on the terrace face. The water is only a few millimeters deep as it passes over the white stone. At the center of the runnel, the flow is clear and quick enough to keep the mineral surface shining. At the margins, where movement slows and the film thins, a faint green line appears. That line suggests organisms using a zone the center cannot offer. The middle is too mobile. The edge is more stable. Yet the edge still receives warmth and dissolved material. So a border forms not a dramatic one, only a soft chromatic seam. Over time, minerals continue to precipitate in and around that seam. The living film may help trap sediment or influence crystal growth at the tiniest scale. Then the stone hardens further. Later, if conditions shift, the color may fade, but the texture it helped begin may remain. In this way, life participates in the recording process. The terraces record water behavior. They also record the places where biology briefly found footing within that behavior. That is especially noticeable in areas where the white is slightly broken by warmth of tone. A terrace can look cream rather than pure white because of the combined influence of fresh mineral deposit, moisture, and biological films. Another may carry a gentle honey tint in low light. Another may be almost blue-white where water is deep enough to reflect sky and no visible film breaks the mineral brightness. These tonal differences keep the slope from ever becoming visually flat. Even within its famous whiteness, there is variety, and that variety has causes. A listener might be tempted to think of those causes as small embellishments on a larger geological truth, but they are more than embellishments. They are part of what allows the larger truth to become visible in such fine detail. Because the microbes in algae occupy specific conditions, they help reveal those conditions to the eye. A green trace tells you something about temperature and persistence of flow. A cream film suggests a certain combination of moisture and fresh precipitation. A clean, bright white may indicate a surface repeatedly rinsed and coated. The colors are subtle notes in a larger sentence about water. This is why the terraces feel increasingly complex the longer you remain with them. At first glance, the wonder lies in the broad spectacle of a white mountain face. At second glance, the wonder lies in chemistry. Deep water rising, gas escaping, stone forming. At third glance, the wonder lies in variation. Some pools active, some dormant, some blue, some matte. Then comes the ecological glance, and with it a more intimate landscape appears. The slope has margins. The margins have inhabitants. And those inhabitants, though easy to overlook, are part of the patterning of the whole. There is a tenderness in that realization. A place famous for starkness turns out to support delicate forms of persistence. The warm spring flow is not simply building mineral shelves, it is also creating temporary homes for organisms adapted to a narrow band of conditions. Those homes are thin and unstable compared to a lake or a forest, yet they are real. And because they are real, changes in water routing or surface moisture do more than alter the look of the stone. They reshape the living edge as well. That broadens the stakes without making them dramatic. To redirect water across a travertine slope is not only to brighten one terrace and leave another dry, it is also to move the boundary between habitats. A microbial film may retreat from a channel that cools less or dries more often. Another may spread where flow becomes steadier. The white architecture and the quiet biology are linked by the same thread of movement. So the hillside is more fully understood as an interface. Groundwater chemistry rises from below. Atmospheric conditions meet it above. Gravity pulls it across the surface. Microbial life takes hold where the resulting narrow conditions permit. And all of this happens on a timescale slow enough to feel peaceful, yet active enough that nothing is completely settled. Even the textures begin to make more sense in this light. Some surfaces feel smooth because fresh mineral deposition repeatedly coats them. Some are velvety because fine crystalline material and thin films interact before hardening. Some appear slightly pitted or rough, where drying, prior growth, and biological traces have left a more irregular skin. What seemed at first like decorative variation becomes evidence of process layered upon process. That is the reason a close look at one modest basin can hold attention for so long. Suppose the basin receives water from a narrow upper spill. The inflow remains warm and clear. The floor beneath is pale, with a bluish cast where water depth increases toward the center. At one side, a cream-toned margin suggests a thin biological film. At the far lip, a bright white edge gleams where fresh precipitation continues. Around the basin's drier upper perimeter, A rougher, chalky texture hints at earlier water levels or intermittent wetting. In a single small pool, you can see hydrology, chemistry, temperature, evaporation, and biology layered together. That compactness is one of Pamukkale's great gifts. It makes large earth processes legible at the scale of a few careful steps. Tectonic extension has shaped the regional plumbing. Groundwater has circulated through carbonate rock. Geothermal warming has altered the water. Degassing at the surface has triggered precipitation. Microbial communities have found footholds at suitable margins, and all of it appears in a shallow basin no bigger than a room. That compression of scale is part of the strangeness too. Normally, the workings of a geothermal system stay hidden. The pathways are underground. The chemistry is invisible. The tectonic setting is something you infer from maps and faults, not from a simple glance. Here, so much of that hidden system writes itself onto an open white hillside. Not all of it, of course. The underground remains mostly unseen, but enough appears at the surface that the place feels almost explanatory. It does not merely exist, it demonstrates. By now, the late morning has become something like a lesson in patience. The hill has already shown that clear water can build stone. It has shown that the stone records slight differences in flow. Now it shows that thin life can settle into those differences and, in small ways, modify them. That matters because the textures are not just ornaments on the surface. They are clues about where the water lingers, where it rushes past, and where the hill is still being rewritten. If you stay with one active margin for a little longer, you can begin to picture how a living terrace becomes an older one. At first, the film of water is steady. It coats the lip, renews the gloss, and keeps the mineral skin bright. Then perhaps the route above shifts by only a little. A different notch in an upper rim becomes the preferred spillway. The thread feeding this edge thins. The basin still receives water, but less often and in a shallower sheet. That is enough to begin changing its future. Fresh deposition slows, moisture leaves the exposed surface more often, the chalky quality increases. A microbial trace that once held on at the edge may retreat or be replaced by another tint better suited to slightly drier conditions. Nothing dramatic happens. The terrace simply moves from active present into quieter memory, and somewhere nearby, another lip receives what this one has lost. That transfer is part of the deeper rhythm of the whole slope. Pamukkale does not grow everywhere equally. It grows by preference. The water selects, then revises its selection. A basin becomes favored. A shelf becomes neglected. A little wall thickens until it changes the route that made it. Then the route goes elsewhere. The result is a landscape that preserves its overall form while quietly rearranging its details. By midday, that realization becomes difficult to ignore. The white hillside is not just evidence that thermal water once passed here. It is evidence that thermal water is still passing, still sorting the slope, still deciding where the next line of stone will settle. That is the moment when the place stops feeling merely unusual and starts feeling almost impossible in the gentlest way. You are not looking at a finished object. You are looking at process made visible. The distinction changes the emotional tone of the whole landscape. A finished object asks to be admired. A visible process asks to be watched. So the eye naturally slows. It settles on one overflow edge where a film of water gathers before slipping over. The lip is thin, rounded, and very bright, as though freshly dusted with pale powder and then sealed with light. Water crosses it in such a clear sheet that the deposit itself remains hidden in motion. You cannot watch crystals form. You cannot see a rim thicken while you stand there. Yet the lip exists because that same event has happened countless times already. Each overflow has left a residue too small to notice. Those residues accumulated. The edge rose. The basin behind it became more defined. The spill concentrated. Then the concentration made the edge more stable still. This is how the hill grows. Not through single events, but through microscopic insistence. Imagine that one rim over the course of an hour. Nothing seems to change. Imagine it over a day, and still the change is almost beyond ordinary sight. Imagine it over a season, a decade, or a long span of recurring flow, and suddenly the entire form becomes legible. The terrace is a time lapse hidden inside apparent stillness. That is why the midday light can feel so clarifying here. It does not make the process faster, it makes the evidence easier to read. The wettest surfaces gleam. The active lips catch the sun as thin white crescents. Shallow pools turn a cleaner blue because the sky now sits high above them. Drier shelves fade to a flatter white. The hillside separates itself into present tense and past tense right in front of you. A present tense terrace reflects, a past tense terrace remembers. Neither is less real, but only one is still directly joined to the current thread of warm water. This creates a new kind of attention. You stop asking how old the whole place is in some broad sense, and begin asking how old this specific surface is in its current state. How recently did this basin brighten? How long has that shelf been waiting? When did this notch become the favored outlet? When did that lower wall stop thickening? The exact answers remain hidden, but the questions themselves are revealing. They remind you that time here is uneven. One part of the slope may be actively gathering new stone, while another is merely preserving older work. And because both are visible together, the landscape holds several moments at once. That layering leads naturally outward, into the larger setting that made such a place possible. The white terraces look so self-contained that it is easy to forget they belong to a wider valley. But by midday, the eye is ready to widen. The slope has taught its local rules well enough that the broader geology can now enter without feeling abstract. Pamukkale sits within the Denizli Basin, a region shaped by extension in the crust. That phrase, crustal extension, sounds large and distant at first. Yet here it has intimate consequences. When a region is stretched over long spans of time, faults open, blocks shift, and pathways for groundwater become more available. Rock that might otherwise remain more sealed becomes more permeable in important places. Heat at depth can then interact with infiltrating water more effectively. The result is not one spectacular eruption, but a prolonged conversation between fractures, groundwater, and carbonate rock. Pamukkale is one sentence in that conversation, written where it reaches the surface. This is useful to remember because the white slope can seem almost decorative if taken alone. Placed back into the basin, it regains its scale. It becomes the visible edge of a hidden plumbing system. Rain does not simply fall on the terraces and create them. The water has traveled. It has moved through the valley's bedrock, circulated downward and upward, met heat, gathered dissolved material, and then emerged. The terraces are therefore less like a surface coating and more like a report from below. They tell you that the underground is open enough, warm enough, and carbonate rich enough to sustain this repeated mineral discharge. Without that wider basin structure, the hillside would not behave this way. The great whiteness depends on the ordinary-looking valley around it. That is one of the quieter surprises. The broad basin itself does not announce its underground complexity with constant spectacle. Fields, slopes, and open land can appear calm and familiar. Yet beneath that calm, groundwater is moving through fractures shaped by tectonic history. In that sense, Pamukkale is honest. It exposes the valley's hidden geology in a form that anyone can see, not through diagrams, through warm white stone. The midday warmth in the air deepens the contrast further. Under a bright sky, the terraces still suggest coolness. They still resemble something snow-like from a distance. But the knowledge of rising thermal water now sits inside that image, changing it. The whiteness is no longer mistaken for cold. It becomes a record of underground heat carried upward by water and translated into stone. That translation matters because it links very different scales of cause and effect. At the deepest scale, heat flow and fault structure matter. At the intermediate scale, groundwater circulation and rock chemistry matter. At the surface scale, degassing, cooling, and overflow geometry matter. At the smallest visible scale, a rim thickens or a basin reflects. Pamukkale joins all of those scales in one view. That is why the place can feel more strange the more accurate your understanding becomes. Usually, explanation makes a landscape seem simpler. Here, it makes the landscape seem richer. Knowing that tectonic extension helped create the pathways does not reduce the beauty of a small basin, it intensifies it. A single white lip now belongs to a very long chain of causes. The earth stretched, fractures formed, groundwater circulated. Heat altered the water, limestone dissolved, thermal springs emerged, gas escaped, stone precipitated. A rim grew, a pool held the sky. Everything local leads back to something deep. As the afternoon begins to edge closer, that wider awareness changes how you read the lower terraces too. What once looked like mere repetition now feels like distribution. The whole slope is receiving, sorting, and spending a hidden resource brought up from underground. Each basin is a place where that resource is momentarily held. Each overflow is a transfer point. Each active lip is a site of conversion. The hillside is therefore not only architecture, it is circulation made visible. There is a kind of softness to that word circulation that suits the place. It avoids the language of violence and force. The water does not attack the hill, it composes it. It moves through the basin, rises through fractures, spreads over the slope, and returns part of itself to stone. The system is patient enough that even cause and effect seem to settle gently into one another. That patience also helps explain why season and weather matter so much without ever becoming the whole story. In summer, stronger evaporation can alter the look of the active surfaces. A shallow film may dry more quickly at the edges. Mineral concentration in the remaining water may change subtly. Some shelves may turn brighter and drier between flows. In cooler seasons, evaporation may relax. The visual balance between wet sheen and matte crust may shift again. Morning light makes the slope one kind of place, midday light makes it another. Evening will do so again. Yet through all of that variation, the basic mechanism persists. Warm mineral water still emerges, it still cools and degasses, it still leaves calcium carbonate behind. This combination of stability and variation is one of the reasons Pamukkale never quite settles into one image. Photographs catch it in a single condition, under one light, with one distribution of active water. But the actual place is more fluid than that. Some channels brighten, some dry. Some lower basins deepen in color when more water reaches them. Some upper shelves become more heavily coated. The overall form remains recognizable, but the surface personality changes. That changing personality gives the white slope something almost atmospheric. Even though it is made of stone, it can seem soft or sharp depending on light, cloud-like in 1 hour, architectural in another, almost blank from afar, then full of minute evidence up close. A broad view of the basin helps hold these shifts together. The Denizli region is not simply a stage behind the terraces, it participates in them. Its tectonic stretching opened the structural roots. Its carbonate geology supplied the material. Its climate helped determine evaporation rates and seasonal appearance. Its groundwater system fed the springs. Pamukkale, in that sense, is not separate from the valley. It is the valley expressing one of its deepest habits. That idea can be followed backward as well as downward. If you mentally trace the water from the terraces into the underground, it disappears into faults, porous layers, and carbonate rock. If you trace the valley itself through longer time, the picture widens again. Extension did not happen all at once. Fractures were opened and reworked over long periods. Hydrothermal circulation was established and maintained through persistent geological conditions. Travertine built and rebuilt over changing pathways. What is visible now is therefore the current arrangement of a very old relationship between heat, water, and rock. That old relationship explains why Pamukkale feels ancient without feeling fossilized. Some ancient landscapes are ancient because the main process has largely ended. Here, Antiquity coexists with activity. The same basic conversation continues. That is why the midpoint of the story changes everything that comes after it. Once you understand that Pamukkale is not only a record of former deposition, but deposition itself, each small observation gains weight. A color shift is no longer decorative. It may indicate a different water history or a biological margin. A dry patch is no longer just visual contrast. It is evidence of changed routing or interrupted renewal. A fresh gleam on a lip is no longer just pretty. It is active geology. The whole hillside becomes more literal and more wondrous at the same time. Even the lower shelves begin to feel newly important. From a distance, they can seem like the faded ending of the terrace system, broad white steps receiving less attention than the upper blue pools. But once the process is understood, those quieter levels become records of redistribution. Some are currently active, fed by focused channels from above. Some have clearly seen more abundant flow in earlier periods. Some may alternate between stronger and weaker activity, depending on routing and seasonal conditions. Their quieter appearance is not a sign that they matter less. It is a sign that the hydrological story is uneven, and that unevenness is the very thing shaping the architecture. If one upper basin spills a little more to the left than to the right over a long period, whole parts of the lower slope can brighten or dim in response. The staircase is connected all the way down. That connection is easiest to feel when you follow a single line of descent with your eyes. A narrow channel leaves an upper pool. It strikes a lower rim and spreads. Part of it collects in a blue basin. Part of it escapes over a bright lip. Then the sheet divides again around a small mineral rise. One branch strengthens a rounded wall below, the other fades over a flatter shelf and disappears. That tiny divergence matters. Given enough time, one branch may build a more durable path. The other may remain only a trace. A whole terrace field can emerge from countless such small decisions. This is where the landscape starts to resemble a memory of water rather than a container for it. Each rim remembers where water slowed. Each basin remembers where water stayed. Each dry ledge remembers where water once passed long enough to leave stone behind. And because warm water still arrives from underground, memory and present action remain interwoven. The hill is both archive and event. It stores earlier flows and hosts new ones. The mind often wants to choose between those two ways of seeing. Is this a relic, or is it a process? Pamukkale refuses the choice. It is both. That refusal is part of its deep calm. Nothing here needs to resolve into one category. A basin can be old in form and new in surface. A rim can be ancient in its general position and freshly coated at this very moment. A microbial tint can be temporary on top of mineral architecture that has persisted far longer. A lower shelf can rest for years and then brighten again if the root returns. Everything is layered. Everything remains available to change. By afternoon, it also becomes easier to appreciate how modest the immediate mechanics are compared to the scale of the visual result. No giant waterfall is required. No roaring geothermal vent. No vast, obvious plume of steam. The system's grandeur comes from continuity, not intensity. Warm water rises quietly but persistently. That is enough. The persistence is what turns invisible chemistry into a white mountain slope. There is something soothing in that fact. The place is not performing, it is simply continuing, and continuation, given enough time, can build forms that appear almost impossible. This shifts the emotional center of the landscape again. At first, the wonder may have come from appearance alone, then from understanding the chemistry, then from realizing the terraces are still growing. Now it begins to come from trust in slowness itself. Pamukkale demonstrates what repeated small changes can do. A little gas leaving water, a little mineral settling, a little lip catching more flow, a little redirection of a channel, a little biological texture at a wet margin, nothing dramatic, and yet the cumulative effect is overwhelming. That cumulative logic extends beyond the terraces into the way the valley reads as a whole. When you step back in imagination, The white slope becomes one visible concentration of broader geothermal life in the region. Thermal waters emerge because the basin is geologically open in the right ways. Travertine forms because carbonate chemistry and surface conditions align. The brightness remains because active flow renews it. Even where the valley appears quiet and ordinary, the same deep architecture is still there. Fractures, pathways, heat, water, and dissolved stone moving slowly through a hidden network. Pamukkale is simply the place where that network becomes impossible to miss. It is also where the contrast between the visible and invisible is most elegant. The underground cannot be seen directly. You cannot watch water threading through faults in the limestone below the basin. You cannot see the chemistry changing in the aquifer as pressure, heat, and dissolved gases interact. But at the terraces, all of that hidden complexity arrives translated into simple forms. A warm pool, a white rim, a blue reflection, a dry shelf, a cream edge, a lower ledge waiting for more water. The language of the underground becomes plain on the hillside. That plainness is important because it keeps the strangeness from becoming obscure. Pamukkale is not strange because it is difficult to describe. It is strange because it looks impossible and then explains itself calmly. The more time you spend there, the more the impossible appearance resolves into a coherent sequence. And yet the coherence never diminishes the wonder. It sharpens it. By late afternoon, shadows begin to lengthen very slightly at the terrace edges, and that subtle shift brings out relief that the brighter hours softened. Rounded rims look more architectural now. Their curves stand out. Shallow scallops along inactive shelves cast delicate lines. The lower basins, especially where water remains pooled, hold onto light in a different way. Their blue appears deeper, not because they have changed greatly, but because contrast has. The hill starts to separate into surfaces, not just brightness. This is an ideal time to notice again how many of those surfaces belong to different histories. A thick upper wall, still wet and luminous, may be building from present flow. Below it, a broad chalky shelf with hairline cracking may represent an older active zone that now receives less water. Farther down, a newly brightened channel may indicate a more recent rerouting. The afternoon light does not create these histories, it helps distinguish them. That distinction matters because it returns the story to consequences. Everything you have learned so far makes later observations more meaningful. The process itself is no longer in doubt. Now the question becomes how it distributes itself across the hillside from day to day, season to season, and over longer stretches of time. This is where the valley setting comes back in with more force. The basin's climate affects evaporation. Seasonal water supply influences discharge and surface persistence in some channels. Small differences in spring output alter the routing across the upper terraces. Those shifts then cascade downslope. Pamukkale may look like one luminous object, but it behaves like a linked watershed of mineral water. Each upper decision echoes below. That is why the broadest view can still feel intimate. A valley-scale process writes room-scale details. A tectonic landscape creates delicate basin rims. Deep circulation produces a film of water only millimeters thick on a white lip. There is tenderness in that compression, and it is one of the reasons the place remains so restful to think about. The causes are large, but the effects are quiet. Nothing needs to be loud to be significant. The more the sun softens toward evening, the more the white terraces begin to resemble the things people so often compare them to. Snowfields, cloud banks, folds of fabric, a frozen cascade. But now those comparisons feel less like explanations and more like poetry. You know what they hide. The hill is not frozen water. It is warmed water made visible as stone. It is not cloth. It is carbonate architecture laid down by overflow and pores. It is not a cloud. It is the surface trace of deep geological circulation in a stretched basin. That knowledge does not harden the image. It deepens it. As the day moves on, the role of stillness becomes more pronounced. The terraces were never noisy, but in softer light, they seem quieter still. Water passes from one pool to the next with almost no sound. The active surfaces continue working while the visual drama reduces. This is the perfect setting for the final shift in perspective before evening fully arrives. So far, the attention has moved from broad appearance to chemistry, from chemistry to architecture, from architecture to thin ecosystems, and from those local details to the valley beneath them. What remains now is to stay with the place long enough for brightness itself to fade. That fading will matter because Pamukkale's strangeness is not only a daylight phenomenon. At dusk, the terraces stop being an image of whiteness and become an image of persistence. When the brightest light leaves, the active water keeps moving. The warm flow does not depend on admiration. It continues its descent. In the softening light, the white surface starts to lose some of its detail, and what remains most visible are the paths the water is still choosing. A bright rim holds on a little longer than the shelf behind it. A shallow pool keeps a faint blue, while the drier terraces beside it settle toward a gentler, flatter white. That change is useful because dusk simplifies the hillside without making it less informative. It removes some of the glare of the day, and in doing so, it lets the structure stand out more clearly. You begin to notice how many of these basins are really small acts of containment. Each one exists because a lip somewhere became high enough to hold water back for a while. Each one remains distinct only as long as overflow keeps renewing that boundary. And so evening does not shut the process down. It reveals how dependent the beauty always was on continuity. A basin with active flow still looks alive, even as the light weakens. A shelf without fresh water slips more quickly into stillness. The difference between them is no longer only color. It becomes rhythm. One part of the slope is still receiving, another is only remembering. That distinction feels especially clear in the lower terraces. By now, the upper pools have taught the principle well enough that the eye can read the quieter shelves below with more confidence. What seems broad and empty from a distance is often full of evidence at close range. A low wall curves across the slope like a frozen wave. Behind it, a shallow floor lies pale and smooth, perhaps recently wet, perhaps only intermittently renewed. Below it, a narrow spill line cuts through the white, indicating where water has most consistently escaped. That narrow line matters, because it tells you where the next terrace may strengthen. If warm mineral water continues to favor that route, even a slight edge can become more substantial over time. The process does not need much to begin. A little hesitation in flow is enough. A little more deposit at one point than at another, and a rim starts to emerge. Once the rim exists, the water itself begins to behave differently. It slows behind the obstacle it helped create. It spills more predictably at the lowest point. That predictability then encourages more precipitation in the same place. This is the deep logic of the whole hillside. The water builds the conditions that shape its own future movement. And the consequence of that feedback is form. Not perfect form, not symmetrical form, but repeated legible form. As evening settles further, the terraces also begin to reveal how much of their appearance depends on thin layers rather than large masses. The white walls are not monumental in the way a cliff is monumental. They are often delicate skins. A few millimeters of active deposit can change the look of an entire shelf. A thin film of water can make one basin luminous and leave the next looking dormant. That sensitivity is part of why Pamukkale feels so alive. The changes do not need to be large to matter. A slight rerouting upstream can alter a whole chain of surfaces below. A little less overflow here means less gloss there. A little more concentration at one notch means a brighter lip on the terrace beneath it. The hillside is full of such small consequences, and at dusk, when the palette narrows, the consequences grow easier to follow. A line of wetness becomes a map, a dry rim becomes an older sentence in the same language. A cream-toned margin, faint now in the fading light, still suggests that life has found room where conditions permit it. Nothing disappears completely. The information just quiets. This quieting also changes how you think about time. In bright daylight, the terraces can seem almost to insist on their surfaces. At dusk, they begin to suggest duration instead. The lower basins feel as though they have been waiting a long time. The rims feel accumulated rather than merely seen. The whole slope becomes less about brightness and more about patience. That word suits Travertine better than almost any other. Pamukkale is patient in the way it grows, patient in the way it records, patient in the way it allows one route of water to matter, then another again. Nothing here is hurried into shape. If a ledge thickens, it thickens by repeated contact. If a basin deepens, it deepens by repeated holding. If a surface brightens, it brightens by repeated renewal. The earth has many fast ways of changing a landscape. This is not one of them. This is change by return. Warm water comes back. It touches the same lip again. It leaves a little more stone. The return is what matters. That helps explain why the terraces can feel almost tender despite their geological scale. The process is persistent, but it is never forceful in appearance. It does not announce itself with noise. It keeps working through contact, through overflow, through thin accumulation. And because the process is so gentle, the viewer has to become gentle too in order to really understand it. You cannot rush a place like this and expect it to explain itself. It explains itself only to the eye willing to notice repetition. The later hour also invites another way of reading the valley around the white slope. During the day, the basin beyond Pamukkale can seem secondary. Now, as the light lowers, the relationship becomes clearer again. The terraces are bright because the valley is geologically open. They are warm because groundwater has moved deeply enough to gather heat. They are white because carbonate rock gave the water something to carry upward. Even in half-light, that chain remains the hidden foundation of everything visible. The surrounding land, quiet and broad, does not compete with the terraces. It supports them. It is the larger body from which this pale surface expression emerges. And because the terraces belong to that wider system, they cannot be understood as isolated decoration on a hillside. They are a trace, a surface trace of faults below, a surface trace of limestone dissolution underground, a surface trace of geothermal circulation that has been going on long enough and steadily enough to leave architecture behind. This is one of the most beautiful things about the place. The deepest causes remain invisible, but their effects are readable. The valley keeps its secrets, and yet not completely. It allows them to reach the surface in warm water, then the water translates them into something almost impossibly soft-looking. The eye sees white basins. The geology says fracture, heat, carbonate flow. Both are true at once, and dusk makes that doubleness feel especially calm. As the sky dims, the reflective pools begin to look less like mirrors and more like held light. They gather whatever brightness remains. Some show pale blue, some only a soft silver. The lower shelves become more uniform in tone, but the active roots remain legible because they still carry moisture. That moisture is enough to keep them distinct. It gives them a living sheen, a slight smoothness, a sense of present action. Nearby, older surfaces retreat into a more powder-like quiet. Again, there is no drama in that difference. Only information. This part is being fed. That part is resting. This edge is still under construction. That one has become evidence of former flow. And because both conditions coexist, the hillside becomes richer as the day declines. It does not lose meaning with light. It gains another kind. One of the gentlest revelations now is how little the terraces need from the sky in order to continue being themselves. The sun may leave, the colors may soften, the outlines may blur. Still, the water arrives warm from below. Still, gas escapes from it into the air. Still, calcium carbonate settles where movement and chemistry allow. The work goes on without audience. That matters. It shifts the place away from spectacle and toward process, completely. In full daylight, it is possible to become distracted by appearance. At dusk, appearance no longer dominates. Process does. You start to feel the hillside not as an image, but as a system remaining active through the evening. That system is delicate in expression, yet broad in cause. Faults in the crust do not close, because the light has changed. Groundwater does not stop circulating because shadows lengthen. Carbonate chemistry does not become less real because the terraces are harder to photograph in low light. The hidden structure beneath the slope remains what it was all day. The surface simply grows quieter in how it presents itself. Quiet, here, is not absence. It is a kind of honesty. Without the glare of noon, the terraces stop trying to resemble snow or cloud so strongly. They become what they are more plainly, warm stone being made by water. That sentence remains strange, but now it feels stable enough to rest inside. It no longer needs surprise. It can simply be true. And once it is simply true, the lower basins become places of reflection in another sense. Not reflection of sky alone. Reflection of process, of dependency, of long repetition. The water reaching them has already passed through many earlier choices. Upper channels selected one path over another. Rims upstream held enough flow to overflow. Shelves above remained active long enough to continue sending water onward. By the time a trickle reaches the lower slope, it carries the whole history of the day's routing with it. So even a modest film of evening water across a white shelf is not simple. It is downstream of everything above. That relationship introduces a kind of humility into the scene. No basin exists alone. No bright lip is entirely self-explanatory. Every active edge depends on prior edges. Every lower terrace depends on what was retained, released, and redirected higher up. The entire slope is a chain of inherited conditions, and that chain is what makes the terraces feel so coherent despite all their variation. Variation never breaks the system. It gives the system texture. As the evening deepens further, the soft biological colors seen earlier begin to grow less obvious, but their influence does not vanish. A channel that looked faintly green in stronger light may now read only as a darker seam. A cream edge may blend into the surrounding mineral white. Still, the knowledge remains. Those subtle life forms are part of this slow architecture too. They occupy the margins where water lingers in the right way. They alter textures in places too fine to notice quickly. They remind you that even a landscape famous for mineral starkness is not truly empty. This matters now because dusk tends to simplify appearances. Knowing the complexity beneath that simplicity becomes part of the experience. A white terrace is never just white. It may be newly coated. It may be intermittently wet. It may be lightly inhabited at the edge by microbial films. It may be the remnant of an older route. It may be waiting for flow to return. Even in dimmer light, the terrace keeps all of those possible meanings. The fading only asks you to remember them more gently. That gentle remembering is enough to carry the story toward the broader valley one more time. When you think of the Denizli Basin now, you no longer imagine it as background. You imagine it as source space, not source in the narrow sense of one spring mouth, but source in the wider sense of tectonic openness, buried limestone, groundwater descent, warming, return. The basin is where the hidden half of Pamukkale takes place. The terraces are where the hidden half becomes visible. That division is elegant. It gives the landscape depth without requiring spectacle. Beneath ordinary ground, circulation continues. At the white slope, circulation appears as overflow and deposit. The whole place is therefore a conversation between unseen and seen, between buried conditions and exposed consequence. This is why the title's question begins to answer itself more clearly now. Pamukkale is strange because it confuses categories that usually stay separate. It looks cold and is warm. It looks fixed and is active. It looks almost lifeless from afar and holds thin ecosystems at the edge. It looks ancient and is still being written. It feels decorative and is actually diagnostic. It is beautiful, yes, but beauty here is not a coating over the science. Beauty is the science made visible in a form the mind does not expect. That is what allows the place to remain compelling even after explanation. Sometimes a mystery disappears when you understand it. Pamukkale does the opposite. It becomes more mysterious in a calmer, deeper way. The more you learn about dissolved minerals, Degassing, microbial films, seasonal variation, and tectonic pathways, the more astonishing it feels that all of those things meet here so quietly. No single element is rare on its own. Carbonate rock is common. Groundwater is common. Faults are common. Warm springs are not unheard of. Microbial films are everywhere life can hold on. But their exact arrangement here produces something unexpectedly graceful. A mountain slope that appears to have been draped in light. And yet even that grace is conditional. The active surfaces remain bright because water still touches them. The lower terraces remain meaningful because the upper ones still feed them. The whole white field remains what it is because underground movement continues. If that continuity weakened enough, the look of the place would shift. Some channels would quiet. Some rims would stop brightening. Some basins would flatten into memory. That possibility is not alarming in tone. It is simply true. Living geological systems depend on active relationships. Pamukkale teaches that in a very visible way. A terrace can only remain a living terrace if chemistry, hydrology, and exposure keep meeting there. This is one reason the lower basins feel especially poignant in evening light. They are the last recipients in a long chain. They show what remains after many earlier pauses and releases. Some are wide and calm, with barely enough water to keep a skin of reflectivity. Some are brighter at the spill line than on the floor, because that is where present deposition matters most. Some look nearly still, but hold the shape of old containment with extraordinary clarity. These lower forms are not lesser versions of the upper pools. They are the slope's memory spread out. Water has arrived here after giving itself, little by little, to everything above. By the time it reaches the lower plane, much of its dissolved burden has already become stone. That does not mean the process is over, only that the character changes. The water grows less dramatic in effect, the terraces widen, the steps become broader. Containment gives way to shallower reading. It is as though the hillside, after all its careful writing, begins to speak more softly near the bottom. That softness feels exactly right. The entire landscape was built by a repeated loss from the water, not a loss in a tragic sense. A loss that creates form. CO2 leaves, calcium carbonate settles, the water becomes less loaded. The hill becomes more defined. Descent and release remain linked all the way down. And evening makes that link feel almost meditative. A little less in the water, a little more in the stone. Again and again. This repeated transfer also explains why the terraces resemble memory more than monument. A monument suggests a single act of making. Memory suggests accumulation through many passes. Pamukkale is cumulative in every sense. Its shape comes from recurrence. Its brightness depends on renewal. Its details change because the same broad process keeps returning under slightly different conditions. If you stand with that thought long enough, the whole slope begins to feel less like an object on the land and more like the land thinking in mineral form. Not in any literal way, only in the sense that the hillside is expressing what the region does best. It receives hidden water. It releases it warm. It lets chemistry become architecture. It lets architecture guide further flow. That sequence is the identity of the place. And even now, as visible detail fades, that identity remains fully present. The water has not forgotten its route. It still arrives from below. It still takes the shape the slope asks of it. It still leaves behind a little more whiteness where the surface allows. By the time true dusk begins to gather, the brightest terraces appear almost self-lit. Of course they are not. They are only holding the last available light more effectively than the darker ground around them. But the impression is gentle and memorable. The white slope hovers. The pools dim more slowly than the valley. The rims seem to float. This visual softness can tempt the mind back toward metaphor. Cloud, moonlit snow, milk poured over stone. Those comparisons return naturally. Yet now they feel earned rather than mistaken. You can enjoy them without losing the geology underneath. In fact, geology is what makes the poetry possible. Without geothermal circulation, There is no warm water. Without dissolved calcium and carbon dioxide, there is no precipitation. Without repeated overflow, there are no basins to catch dusk in the first place. The dreamlike look depends on exact physical causes. That union of dreamlike appearance and precise mechanism may be the strangest thing of all. And it continues into the night. Even when color is mostly gone, the paths of water still exist. Some would remain legible by sheen alone, some only by touch, if touch were possible. A warmer film over a smooth rim, a still pool held behind a brighter crescent of deposit, a drier shelf with a more powdery skin. The hillside continues differentiating itself through moisture, texture, and heat, even after daylight can no longer show every distinction. This raises another quiet realization. Pamukkale is not made for 1 hour of viewing. Its form changes character across the day because the visibility of its processes changes with light. Morning emphasizes emergence. Midday clarifies activity. Afternoon separates histories. Dusk reveals persistence. None of those readings cancels the others. They layer. The landscape can be understood in phases because the process itself is continuous enough to survive every phase of light. That continuity makes the evening feel complete without making the story finished. There is still more water above. There are still routes not followed with the eye. There are still lower surfaces where the day's remaining brightness gathers and then fades. And there is still the deeper valley logic beneath all of it. The tectonic basin remains stretched and fractured below the darkness. Groundwater remains in motion through buried carbonate rocks. Heat still waits at depth. The terraces are only the visible skin of those older, larger conditions. So even as night takes shape, nothing about the place becomes empty. It becomes concealed again. This return to concealment feels important. At the beginning, the mystery of Pamukkale came from appearance. Now the mystery has moved downward. You know more about what the springs are doing, more about why the terraces are white, more about how rims and pools form, more about how life enters at the margins, more about how the basin beneath supports everything. Yet for all that, the underground remains mostly hidden. The full path of the water cannot be seen. The exact timing of every shift in flow cannot be known by sight alone. The next favored channel has not yet declared itself. The next brightened basin has not yet fully formed. So understanding does not close the place. It only deepens the unseen part. And that is a good place for evening to leave you, not with uncertainty in a restless sense, with openness, with the feeling that the hill is still going on beyond what the eyes can hold. The lower terraces, especially now, invite that feeling. They are wide enough to feel almost horizontal. Some collect the last softness of the sky. Some flatten into white plains with only a faint suggestion of basins remaining. The overflow edges between them are subtle, sometimes visible only as a slightly brighter curve. It is here that the phrase Travertine plain begins to make emotional sense. The staircase relaxes, the architecture stretches out, the water, having passed through so many earlier forms, moves with even less display. This plainness is not emptiness. It is the final thinning of the same process. Water still arrives, deposit still forms, but the writing becomes broader and quieter. A lower terrace may receive only a delicate sheet of overflow. That sheet may be enough to renew the gloss along one edge and leave the rest waiting. Another shelf may hold only a remnant pool, smooth and faintly blue-gray in the dimness. A nearby rim may show scalloped traces from former conditions more active than the present one. Everywhere, the scale widens and the voice lowers. That broadening matters because it completes the descent the hillside began in the first light. In the fading light, the lower slope begins to reveal the final answer to a question that has been present all along. What remains of the water after so much stone has already been made? The answer is not absence. It is continuation in a quieter form. By the time the flow reaches these broader shelves, much of its dissolved load has already been spent on upper rims, narrow spillways, and younger basins. Yet the water is still mineral water. It still carries the chemistry of its underground passage. It still cools in open air. It still releases what it can no longer hold. So even here, where the surfaces flatten and the basins seem less dramatic, the hillside is not finished speaking. It is only speaking more softly. A shallow sheet crosses one lower terrace in a line so thin it almost disappears, except where the last light catches it. Along that line, the white looks newly sealed, as though the surface has been brushed with a fresh skin of mineral gloss. A little farther away, the same shelf grows dull and powder-like, showing where the sheet no longer reaches. That contrast is enough to tell a whole story. The active zone is still part of the present network. The matte zone belongs more to earlier flow. The difference may be only a few steps wide, but on a living travertine slope, a few steps can separate renewal from pause. This is why the lower plane feels so thoughtful in the evening. It reduces the scale of the changes until they become almost whisper small. No great basin demands attention. No single rim dominates. Instead, the eye moves across subtle decisions. Here the water spread too thin to build much height. There it pooled just long enough to leave a brighter edge. Elsewhere it chose a narrow exit, and that narrowness gave the next surface below a little more definition. The architecture grows broader, but the logic stays exact. That exactness keeps the lower terraces from becoming merely decorative endings to a more spectacular upper slope. They are not endings, they are consequences. Everything that happened above arrives here in diluted form, translated into wider shelves, fainter spill lines, and shallower holding places. The lower slope is where the whole system becomes easiest to read as a chain. You can imagine one parcel of warm water starting high at the spring outlet. You can follow it over one lip, then another, then into broader basins, then over flatter ledges, then into this quiet final spread. At each stage, something is left behind. At each stage, the path narrows or widens according to what earlier water already built. By the time it reaches the lowest terraces, the water has become a kind of summary of the entire hillside, less concentrated in visual effect, no less meaningful. There is another softness here too. The rims on the lower terraces often look less sharply bounded than those above. Some curve outward in low pale swells. Some break into scalloped margins where former water levels can still be read in delicate mineral lines. Some seem almost to dissolve into the slope, as if the terrace has not decided whether it wants to be basin or plain. That ambiguity makes sense. Lower on the hill, the energy of the flow is reduced. Water has spread, slowed, and been divided many times already. A broad shelf may receive only intermittent overflow. A basin may fill only shallowly before passing water on. Where the conditions for strong containment weaken, form becomes gentler, the rims do not vanish, they relax. And that relaxation tells you something important about how travertine architecture depends not only on chemistry, but on concentration. Where flow is focused, rims can rise and sharpen. Where flow is diffuse, deposition may still continue, but the resulting forms remain lower, wider, more understated. The same water writes in different styles depending on how tightly it is gathered. That is one of the clearest lessons on the lower plane. A line of descent that looks strong and bright higher up may become a faint fan by the time it arrives here. That fan can still leave stone behind. It just leaves it across a larger area and with less dramatic relief. So the landscape changes character without changing principle. The rule remains the same. Warm mineral water meets air, loses some dissolved gas, and leaves calcium carbonate behind. Only the geometry shifts. What was once a concentrated spill becomes a broad glaze. What was once a crisp lip becomes a low border. What was once a blue bowl becomes a barely held mirror. That change in geometry matters because it answers, in a physical way, why Pamukkale does not simply become one giant white wall from top to bottom. The slope is sorting the water as it descends. Upper basins trap and redirect. Middle terraces strengthen some paths and weaken others. Lower shelves receive what remains after repeated divisions. The whole field is a hierarchy of retention and release. And because each level affects the next, no part of the hillside can be understood in isolation. This is especially visible in evening, when shadow reduces distraction and leaves only structure. A bright crescent on a lower shelf tells you an upper root is still active enough to feed it. A dry hollow suggests a former connection now interrupted. A faintly wet seam crossing a wide white floor suggests the present flow is still searching, still testing, still distributing itself according to the shape inherited from earlier deposition. This searching quality is important. Water does not move over a blank surface here. It moves over a surface already built by water. That means every present route is partly guided by older routes, and every older route was once the result of an even earlier one. The lower terraces show this most clearly because their broad forms preserve old guidance even when active flow has become slight. A water line can cross a shelf that looks nearly inactive, and yet the shape beneath it reveals where more abundant overflow once traveled. A low embankment may now hold only a shallow film, while still preserving the contour of a former basin that was once more fully fed. In this way, the lower slope keeps memory in wide strokes. The upper terraces speak in sharp, bright, present tense. The lower ones often speak in layered tenses at once. That layered quality gives the evening landscape a feeling almost like reading through old pages that are still being written on. A fresh line of gloss crosses an older white field. A current spill follows a contour shaped by much earlier deposition. A small active basin rests inside a broader form that may have held more water in another season, or under another routing pattern. Nothing here is singular. Each visible surface belongs to more than one time. That is why the final movement of the hillside feels so calm. The lower plane does not demand that you decide whether Pamukkale is ancient or active. It shows you both conditions touching. A dry shelf can be old in surface and young in edge, if fresh water has only recently returned to one part of it. A wide basin can be old in shape and current in its spill line. A shallow pool can reflect the evening sky, while sitting inside a contour built by centuries of earlier overflow. The strange beauty of the place comes partly from this refusal to separate times cleanly. Everything accumulates, everything remains available to change. Even the fine textures become more eloquent when seen this way. On one lower terrace, the floor may look almost silky, coated repeatedly by thin flow that leaves no large crystals visible to the eye. On another, a chalkier roughness suggests longer interruptions between wet periods. Elsewhere, a delicate corrugation may mark the edge of a retreating or fluctuating water line. These are not random imperfections. They are records of how often water returned, how long it lingered, how evenly it spread, and how thoroughly fresh mineral deposition renewed the surface. At this scale, the hillside begins to resemble weather patterns fixed into stone, not storms, not violent events, more like recurring habits. A shelf habitually rinsed becomes smooth. A margin habitually neglected becomes powdery. A favored notch becomes brighter. A basin frequently replenished remains reflective longer into the evening. The more gently you look, the more the plane reveals itself as habit made visible. That sense of habit connects the terraces back to the springs without needing to see them. You no longer need the upper slope in view to feel the hidden origin. A fresh, wet line on the lower plane implies deep circulation as surely as a spring mouth does. For water to arrive here at all, the whole chain above must still be functioning. The tectonic pathways below must still be open enough for warm groundwater to rise. The carbonate chemistry must still be doing its invisible work in the subsurface. The upper channels must still be receiving and passing flow. So the lower terraces, quiet as they are, remain connected to the deepest causes in the system. That is one of the most elegant things about Pamukkale. The largest geological factors do not only announce themselves in the most dramatic places, they also appear in the thinnest film on the quietest shelf. A fault deep in the crust has no obvious likeness to a pale crescent of fresh deposit on a lower rim, and yet they belong to the same chain of cause and effect. The earth opened, groundwater circulated, heat altered it, carbonate dissolved, thermal springs rose. Water crossed the hill, stone remained. The lower terrace is therefore not merely receiving what is left, it is completing a sequence that began far below sight. That completion has its own dignity. The plain at the bottom of the terrace field is not the exhausted remainder of a stronger system above. It is the place where the system broadens into its quietest expression. The water has spent much of its mineral burden, yes, but what remains is enough to maintain the logic of the landscape, enough to brighten a low edge, enough to preserve a shallow bowl, enough to keep continuity visible, enough to remind you that the hillside is fed from below, even when the flow has become delicate. That delicacy also helps explain why the lower basins can feel especially unresolved. An upper pool often presents itself clearly. It has an inflow, a holding space, an overflow lip. A lower terrace may be harder to classify at first glance. Is it one basin or several joined by slight depressions? Is that pale curve an active rim or the remnant of an older one? Is the faint wetness across the floor enough to call it a pool, or is it only a passing sheet? These questions are not signs of confusion. They are signs that the process here has become less concentrated and more distributed. The lower plane is where Travertine stops looking obviously architectural and starts looking more like topography made by repeated, very gentle decisions. That makes it a fitting place to think again about how the whole white slope began. Not with one event, not with one outpouring, but with circulation, repetition, and release. The lower terraces preserve that truth because they are made of the smallest consequences. They show what the system becomes when nothing is hurried and nothing is wasted. Even a thin remaining film can still add to the surface. Even a low rim can still redirect the next trickle. Even a broad chalky shelf can still be reawakened if an upper root changes. Nothing is fully abandoned. Nothing is absolutely fixed. This open-endedness is one reason the landscape feels so alive at dusk. Not alive in the sense of movement everywhere, alive in the sense of possibility still present in every contour. A dried basin is not dead stone. It is a former answer that may one day become current again. A faint notch in a low wall is not only erosion. It may be the beginning of a future spillway. A surface that looks complete may still be awaiting one more season of steady overflow to alter its character. The terraces always remain slightly unfinished, and in the evening that unfinished quality feels less like incompletion and more like peace. The hillside does not need to arrive at a final form. Its beauty comes from remaining responsive. That responsiveness includes the smallest life at the mineral edge as well. Even though the fading light makes the creams, greens, and pale golds harder to distinguish, the lower terraces still carry the traces of those narrow ecosystems. Some broad shelves may host almost none of it, because the film of water is too intermittent or the chemistry too harsh. Others, especially where flow remains thin but persistent, may hold faint microbial margins that subtly alter the tone of the white. Again, these effects are not dramatic. They are part of the hillside's fine print, yet they matter because they remind you that even the quietest plain here is not purely inert. Where the conditions are just right, life still enters the story. It may help trap fine particles. It may change the roughness of a wet surface. It may influence how minerals accumulate at the tiniest scale. Then the mineral skin may harden and preserve part of that interaction. So even at the lowest reaches, the slope remains an interface between deep geology and open air, between chemistry and shape, between water and stone, between mineral deposition and thin biological persistence. That layered identity is what keeps the place from ever becoming simple. The broad white shelves at dusk may look almost blank from a distance. Up close, they are full of causes. A slight dip marks former pooling. A brighter curve marks present overflow. A smoother patch suggests regular wetting. A rougher one suggests pores. A warmer tint at the edge hints at microbial occupation. A deeper blue-grey tone suggests standing water over a more reflective floor. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is ornamental in the empty sense. The beauty of Pamukkale is structural. It comes from relations that can be felt as clearly as they can be described. The lower plane also restores a sense of scale that the close reading of basins can sometimes narrow. Standing among detailed rims and channels, it is easy to become absorbed in the few feet in front of you. On these wider shelves, the eye can spread again. You can see how the whole slope has been descending in thought as well as in form. The upper sources introduced the hidden chemistry. The mid-slope terraces demonstrated how overflow becomes architecture. The living margins added ecology to mineral process. The valley beyond revealed the tectonic and geothermal setting. And now the lower plane gathers all of that into one softer field, where every cause remains present but less sharply outlined. That gathering is not a conclusion. It is another reveal. Pamukkale is strangest not at the moment it first dazzles the eye, but at the moment it becomes coherent all the way down. Once you understand that the same warm groundwater rising through faults in a stretched basin can create both a bright upper pool and a faint lower sheen, the entire hillside changes. No part is decorative. No part is incidental. The lower plane is as necessary as the upper spring. It is where the chain of cause and effect completes one pass and prepares for the next, because there will always be a next pass. Night does not interrupt the underground supply. The thermal water does not stop because color leaves the sky. The terraced field continues receiving, sorting, and depositing long after visible detail begins to fade. This is worth lingering on, because it quietly transforms the place from scenery into ongoing event. During the day, you can see the event. At dusk, you begin to trust it. You no longer need every active line to remain visible. You know what is happening even where light no longer shows it clearly. Warm mineral water is still moving across white stone. Carbon dioxide is still leaving the water. Calcium carbonate is still settling out. A rim somewhere is still gaining another microscopic layer. A lower shelf somewhere is still being renewed by a film so thin it can only be inferred. That hidden continuation is almost more moving than the daylight spectacle. It means the place is not dependent on observation to remain itself. It keeps building in the dark, and the dark suits it. Without the bright insistence of afternoon, the white plain begins to resemble what it truly is, a slow memory of underground motion spread out in stone. The valley around it sinks into lesser detail. The terraces hold on a little longer, then they too begin to merge into broader tones. Still, some lines persist. A curved rim catches the last pale light. A shallow pool keeps a dim bluish center. A wet channel reflects more than the dry shelf beside it. These final visible distinctions feel almost like the last spoken words of the hillside before it returns to silence. But even that silence is not empty. It is full of process continuing below notice. That is why the place feels so restful rather than strange in an unsettling way. Its strangeness is orderly. Its beauty is causal. Its mystery is not built on threat, but on scale and patience. Everything here can be understood and still remain wondrous. Everything can be named and still feel slightly unreal. That balance is rare. A lower terrace holding only a skin of water can express it perfectly. The shelf looks almost motionless, yet its brightness tells you movement is still there. Its rim looks settled, yet its edge tells you stone is still being added. Its floor looks barren, yet its tone may carry the soft trace of microbial life at a margin. Its shape looks complete, yet one change in the root above could alter what it becomes next. That one shelf contains the whole hillside in miniature, and so the eye keeps moving slowly across the broadening plain. It notices where the active water still chooses a line. It notices where old containment remains legible after fresh flow has weakened. It notices where the white has hardened into a dry record, and where it still glistens with present contact. The pattern is calmer now, but not simpler. If anything, it is more complete, because here, near the lower end of the descent, the terraces no longer compete for attention as individual wonders. They join into one connected field of evidence. Evidence that underground heat can surface as quiet water. Evidence that dissolved stone can become architecture. Evidence that life can settle into mineral margins. Evidence that a whole basin's tectonic history can appear in the shape of a white hillside. And evidence that all of these things can keep happening with almost no sound at all. The lower basins hold that silence especially well. Their shallowness softens sound instead of sharpening it. There is no plunge, no splash, no dramatic release. Only thin overflow, gentle contact, and occasional stillness so complete that the water seems to vanish until the light reveals it again. This softness at the bottom of the slope is not an afterthought. It is the correct final register of the process. Water rose from depth carrying invisible material. It passed from pool to pool, leaving form behind. Now, on the broad terraces near the base, it becomes almost all surface and almost no display. This is how the hillside settles into evening, not by stopping, by thinning. That thinning suggests another important truth. Pamukkale is not one perfect fixed arrangement that the water merely decorates. It is a field of possibilities constrained by gravity, chemistry, and earlier deposition. The path taken tonight may not be exactly the path taken in another season. The basin brightest now may not always be the brightest one. The lower shelf, still receiving a reflective film, may, under different routing, become a drier archive while another nearby shelf awakens. The whole place remains mobile within limits. The limits are geological, the motion is hydrological, the result is visual serenity held open by structural change. That is why it never feels static for long, even when nothing obvious moves. As darkness gathers a little more firmly, the lower plane begins to lose small textures first. Fine cracks, faint scallops, and cream-toned margins flatten into broader white-grey fields. Then only the clearest active surfaces remain distinguishable. A sheen here, a held pool there. A brighter lip, barely visible. This reduction is strangely helpful. It strips the terraces down to their essentials. Water, stone, slope, continuation. What the daylight elaborated, evening distills. And in that distilled state, the place becomes almost impossibly simple. Warm water from below, white stone left behind, a hill made by repetition. That simplicity is not a reduction of the wonder. It is the core of it. The science does not disappear into poetry here. The poetry grows directly out of the science. A stretched valley allows deep circulation. Deep circulation warms groundwater. Warm